Hi, everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Victoria Nicola. I'm an indie author who also happens to be a Soviet Union refugee. And I want to talk in equal parts about writing and my books and my family's experience in the Soviet Union, our awful experience in the Soviet Union, and the philosophy of Marxism, socialism, and communism as a whole, just because of our personal awful experience. And today I wanted to talk about a very specific topic again. I mentioned it in my last post, is this concept that it was communism that won Hitler in World War II. So let's talk about it. First of all, what I wanted to say is that I honor the sacrifice of the people of the Soviet Union. This has nothing to do with me putting down their sacrifice. A lot of my family, I'll talk about it later about like my family's experience in World War II, but my family suffered in World War II, and my great uncles fought, and my grandfather fought in World War II. So I honor their sacrifice. Okay, this has nothing to do with me not honoring everything that they have those generations had done to protect their land and families. And I also honor the sacrifice of all the other ally nations. Okay, when I'm going to specifically right now talk about the sacrifice of the Soviet Union, but this isn't to make light of the sacrifice of the American people, of the French, of the British. I know we like to make fun and jokes about the French, how they kind of just laid back and let the Germans do whatever, but I honor all their sacrifice. Every country that participated, okay, everybody had some kind of part to play in that war. So again, that's not to make light of all the other countries, of the allied countries that participated to fight the Axis powers. Okay, so let's get into the actual argument. So, when we talk about the Soviet Union fighting Hitler, somehow it automatically turns from the Soviet Union or the people of the Soviet Union to communism fighting the Nazism or fascism. However, when we talk about, for example, American participation or the British participation or the French, we don't talk about capitalism fighting fascism, right? We don't somehow phrase it that way. But for some reason, Soviet Union, and so the Soviet Union, it immediately turns to communism fighting fascism. So there's a discrepancy there. That's my point number one. Very simple. Simple. Like if we're not going to use capitalism in the American, the British, and the French cases, why are we using communism in the case of the Soviet Union? That's just point number one. I know actually what probably the response would be. The response would be that because the Soviet Union sacrificed the most. However, while I agree that the Soviet Union sacrificed the most lives, the most land, all that, um, what I don't agree with is, like I said, this concept that it was communism itself rather than the people. The people did. The people fought very hard to protect their land and their families. By the way, I have my phone again for notes because I want to stay on track because I get lost on tangents. Okay. Um, However, the sacrifice of the people of the Soviet Union, that is despite communism. All right. That isn't because of communism. Communism didn't do some special magic voodoo that made people sacrifice the most. No. In fact, that part, like the previously before the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union, it was the Russian Empire, right? The Russian Empire was notoriously good at fighting wars. And I know everyone's gonna come at me with like the Russo-Japanese War and World War One. Those are already later circumstances of kind of like a falling apart, decaying empire. But prior to that, the Russian Empire was very good at fighting wars. I mean, it was famously what saved Europe from Napoleon. And in fact, the largest the empire ever grew was under Catherine the Great, when it was actually a feudalistic empire. Um, so that part of the world, it was very good at fighting wars. That was like its culture, like spreading its land, all that. So I think that for some reason, people forget that, you know? There's a reason why Russia, for better or worse, like it or hate it, many people hate it. I get it. There's a reason why Russia is the biggest country in the world in terms of, yeah, landmass. So, um, the whole like, the Soviet Union won because of communism makes no sense if you look at the Russian Empire as a whole and their history of fighting wars. Okay. And in general, that part of the world also has a very, um, it has a disregard for human life, unfortunately, because of this war culture. There was this very infamous saying, "Baba еще не рожают," which literally translates to um, women will birth more, but that's like a nicer way of putting it. It's very slangy and crude, this saying. And this saying actually became popularized in a movie that was done in the Soviet Union, but it was about Peter the Great, who was also like crying about some war, losing some kind of battle. Um, However, it became very, very popular. The saying became popular in the Soviet Union and communism. It spread like wildfire. I wonder why. Surely not because the communists really cherished life. That's sarcasm, by the way. Um, Communists, you know, didn't, I think they were even worse than previous czars. They didn't cherish life, they didn't cherish culture. They eliminated left, right, and center anything that did not support their ideology. Okay, so communism was the worst. Communists and this ideology was the worst culprit of this phrase, of this kind of concept of like, women will just give birth to more soldiers, no problem. We can lose as many as we want. So all the soldiers that were sacrificed in World War II, they unfortunately were sent into the meat grinder with a very low regard for human life. So the fact that a lot of soldiers went with some kind of patriotism and loyalty to their country is actually kind of astonishing, given the circumstances of how communism treated them. So again, it's their sacrifice is despite communism rather than because of communism. Okay, so that's another point. Now, many people sacrificed uh obviously their sons, their fathers, their uncles, their um grandsons, and people obviously sacrificed their life who were not even communism. No, communists. Sorry, I'm like getting lost with communism and communists and communists. Okay, whatever. You know what I'm saying. So a lot of people who are not even communist fought in the war. How do I know that? Because that's my family. So I have a great uncle that died on every side of my family, and who they were not communists. They were actually religious folk. They were Christians who were persecuted, by the way. So again, they participated in the war despite the persecution that the government bestowed upon them. And the side of the family that I do not have a great uncle that died, that was because that side, my grandfather fought, and three of his brothers, so four kids, four boys from one family, all went to the front and all survived. And it was a miracle. Like people just couldn't even believe that all four survived. But here's the sad, dark irony of that. While they were at the front fighting for their country, their father was imprisoned for faith and killed in prison. So again, despite it being communist, they all did that. They sacrificed their freedoms, their lives, um, despite the fact that their father was imprisoned, okay, and then killed by the state. So and of course, here I do not have statistics of like how many people in the Soviet Union were actually communist versus not. Hello, like you can't have statistics like that because nobody in their right mind would answer truthfully statistics like that because they would be persecuted. They would be considered enemies of the state, like my great grandfather who was in prison and killed. Um, so but obviously, a lot of people in the Soviet Union were still religious, whether Christian or Muslim or whatever. Um, they were religious, so they were not true communists. You know, there was a lot of faking or smiling and nodding just to like let the state kind of ignore them so they could do what they want. Um, and a lot of people were just politically not active. They didn't care. I mean, how many people just got swept up all of a sudden? They didn't do anything. They don't care about who is governing their country. They just care about like familial matters and putting food on their table. And suddenly the country is communist. That's like, I mean, imagine today how many people are not political and, the parties switch. How many people don't even vote? Millions of people don't vote in America. It's the same in the Tsarist Russia that like then switched into communist Russia or the Soviet Union. And all the republics, all the people that were in those republics were just like, I guess we're doing communism now, like they weren't particularly, passionate either way. They were just like, okay, can I go put food on my table? They were concerned with those basic needs. So again, I don't have statistics for that, but I'm willing to bet more than 50% were not passionate communists. If not, yeah, I think it was a very large percent, except we just don't know because we can't know because no one's actually going to be honest about it. Um, okay, so that's point number three, I think. All right. Um, so here's an argument that I hear a lot is if it wasn't for communism, the industrialization wouldn't have happened. And so the Soviet Union wouldn't have had all the military equipment that they did to defeat the Nazis. Again, this is where I will direct you to my last video about the industrialization argument, because industrialization was already happening under the last Tsar. I would say the last couple of Tsars. Industrialization started happening in the late 1800s in Russia, and I already talked about the statistics there. So if you want to watch that, please, I'll link the video in the notes. But basically, the railroads were already being built. The factories were already being built. Education was already spreading. They were building schools. They were already prepping, kind of to bring the country into the 20th century. Um, so that industrialization argument falls flat once again. And not only does it fall flat because industrialization started before the communists ever took over. But the communists hindered a lot of the industrialization and the progress. The civil war that ensued after the revolution, they eliminated every competent general practically. There were a couple, I think, military people that switched sides, but they were if they were not eliminated immediately, usually the most competent were immediately eliminated. A lot of the ones that switched sides were eliminated later. All right. Not only were the people eliminated, competent farmers, competent soldiers and generals and all that, but factory owners, competent factory owners were eliminated. How do I know that? Once again, because yes, I mentioned my direct line. They were more landowners, small landowner farmers and stuff. But I have a lot of kind of distant family that owned small farms, small factories, and they had little companies and they were producers of sorts of various things. And they all fled because it was all taken from them. They all fled. So communists had to institute new people, and oftentimes the people that they instituted into positions of power in these factories were ideologues rather than competent workers of producing whatever that factory happened to produce. So once again, communism actually hindered a lot of the progress that would have continued and would have exponentially been built that started under the Tsars. So that's point number four. All right. And lastly, I wanted to mention another statistic that I did not mention in that last video. This is a very important one. The statistics of soldiers who deserted the post in World War I versus World War II. So it depends on uh, who you kind of trust for the statistics. But I'll tell you mainstream statistics. Even if you take mainstream statistics that tend to even lean left, even they will say like about 1 million soldiers deserted in World War I, and like close to 2 million deserted in World War II. Okay. More soldiers eventually deserted. I don't think it qualifies as deserted in World War One after the revolution because now there's no Tsar and they didn't know what was happening with the war, so they just returned home. They didn't like desert and like flee to some, other country to escape the war. No, there was no Tsar, there was no government, and so they just went back home. So that doesn't really count as desertion. Um, uh, and that happened later anyway. The 1 million soldiers deserting statistic was before the revolution. Now, if you listen to Gavaruhin, who is the maker of that documentary, The Russia That We Lost, by his estimates, he dug in the actual records of the last Tsar's regime and early Soviet Union records. Um, by his records estimates, I think it was like approximately 500,000 soldiers deserted in World War One, and again, like 1.5, 1.7 million deserted in World War Two. So that shows you who the soldiers were loyal to, despite the messaging that we received, that so many people were so disgruntled with the Tsar. Nobody liked the Tsar. The Tsar was considered this autocratic despot who ruled with an iron fist, blah, blah, blah. Like all this messaging that we get. It's interesting, isn't it? Despite all that, like so much fewer soldiers deserted their posts in World War One versus in communism, the penalty for desertion, if you ever were found, was execution. It's very harsh. And if not torture and then execution, right? And still almost 1 million more, and depending on how you count it, maybe close to 2 million soldiers deserted their posts in World War II. So that's pretty astounding numbers. Um, so there you go. This is my perspective on um, why I do not appreciate or support or condone the concept and the phrase that communism won World War II, or if it wasn't for communism, Hitler and fascism would have spread through the world. No, 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 no. Not communism. The people who lived in the Soviet Union, plus the rest of the Allied countries. All right. Let's just be very extra clear about that. Anyways, what do you guys think about this topic? What do you think about my arguments? Have you heard any of these? Have you thought about this? I'm sure I'm gonna probably tick off quite a bit of people with this topic and my thoughts here because people, for some reason, love arguing about like World War II, communism defeating Hitler. I see it all the time in my TikTok posts. So, anyways, I'm sure I'm gonna kind of ruffle some feathers with this topic, but let me know what you guys think. I always love to hear different, I don't know, different points of view, and also as long as it's not just like crapping on me, like actual, like intelligent perspectives. Or if you've heard any other statistics that support or even maybe not support this argument, let me know. I do have a book coming out next week, which is crazy because I kind of put it on the back burner. And then this week I realized, oh my gosh, it's already next week. And it is set, it's actually this book right here. How many nobles does it take to plan an assassination? And it's set during World War One, right before the revolution. It's about the planning and unaliving of Rasputin. I don't know what words I can and cannot say on YouTube. They're pretty strict on TikTok. That's why I'm using the word unalive. Um, but anyways, even though technically assassination's in the title. So it's the plotting of his assassination. So it's a dark comedy alternative history. It's not a very long book. I super enjoyed writing it though. If you've ever watched the movie The Death of Stalin, which is one of my top favorites, or have ever read the book City of Thieves, which is also a dark comedy set in World War II. This is set in World War One, like I said, so not the same, but similar in vibes. Anyways, if you guys want to support me, I'd love it if you guys could buy the book. It's available for pre-order, and of course, if you're seeing it after Tuesday, June 23rd, then it's already available for purchase. I'd love it if you guys could support me and buying it. And if you guys read it, let me know your thoughts. I always love hearing from readers as well. Again, see you guys in my next video. Have a lovely day.